Hello, health champions. Is quarantine and lockdown the best way to deal with the coronavirus epidemic? And is the vaccine the only way to get back to a normal life? Or are there other options, maybe a little more relaxed, like what Sweden is doing, that can accomplish many of the same things? Today we'll explore all of these questions and we will talk about how you can change the odds. Coming right up. Hey, I'm Dr. Ekberg. I'm a holistic doctor and a former Olympic decathlete. And if you want to truly master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss anything. Early on, when the coronavirus first started spreading, I think a lot of us were under the impression that if we just wash our hands and wear our face masks, then this nuisance will go away in a couple of weeks. As we have seen by now, the epidemic has reached very quickly every corner of the planet. So then they started talking about not preventing the spread, but slowing the spread, flattening the curve. And that has been successful in most cases, but now we kind of realize that it's here to stay. There will be times where it increases and there will be some decreases, but it's not really going away. Just like we have gotten used to talking about the flu season, unfortunately, we might be looking forward to corona season as well. And if we look at the new cases in the world, that kind of speaks of that story that is going to stick around for a while. We see the red line here is a 7-day average of new cases. So in March, it was still increasing. But then for the last 5-6 weeks, it's been holding pretty steady, right between 75 and 100,000 new cases per day. Are we any closer to a normal life? Well, if we have an increase of the epidemic, then we increase the constraints, we increase the protective measures, we get a control, we get a plateau, and then it decreases. And then we feel safe, so we open up things, we relax things a little bit. But if we don't have a widespread immunity when we start opening things back up, then we're just asking for another wave. And that's what they're afraid of, that we don't really have enough immunity to protect us. So anytime we relax, we're going to have a second wave and maybe a third and maybe a fourth. And that will keep on going. Normal life probably can only come back after we have immunity. When enough people are immune, then there's not enough people left to contaminate anymore, to infect. So one way to get immunity is to become infected. You catch the virus, your immune system fights it, you recover, and now you have immunity. They're arguing a little bit about how long it'll be, but they're pretty sure that you're going to have immunity for at least the rest of the season. Then after that, it might be like the flu, where it'll come back in a slightly different version. But if you fight it off one season, then you're probably safe for that season. And if you fought it off on your own, then you can probably do it again. So that immunity, even though it may not be forever, you have pretty much 100% immunity. The other way to gain immunity is with the vaccine. So instead of the live virus, the full strength virus, they weaken it a little bit and they inject it, and now your body sends an intruder and your body starts making antibodies to that weakened virus. Now, that is probably not going to be quite as effective. You can get some good immunity, but you don't know if you have that level of immunity. The key to everything here is called R naught. That's the reproductive factor. It's how fast does the virus replicate in human hosts. So it's depending on 3 different factors, and P stands for the probability of transmitting. How virulent, how pathogenic is this virus? What's the probability that if an infected person meets another person that there will be an infection? The second variable is called C, and that's the number of contacts per day that a person makes. So if an infected person meets one person, or if they meet 10 people, there is a difference. The more people you meet, the more likely you'll spread it around. And the last factor is L, or latency. So the longer it takes between infection and symptoms, the more likely that you'll give it to a lot of people. If there's a very short period, you figure out quickly that you're sick and you stop spreading it. But if you don't know for a week or even longer, then you could meet hundreds of people and pass it on. The higher all of these factors are, the greater R naught is. So how does that relate to herd immunity? Well, the R value for coronavirus has been estimated at about 2.5. Some estimates have gone as high as 5.7, but they're not really sure because there's a lot of variables in there. But let's say that the R value is 2.5. So each person that gets infected passes it on to 2.5 people on average before they know they're infected and they stop spreading it. But if we have 60% of the population is immune, if 60 people out of every 100 are already immune, then they can only pass it on to 40 potential people out of every 100 they meet. So even if the pathogenicity is 2.5, then we got the R value down to 1. And that's a critical juncture because anything over 1 means the infection is going to grow. If every person infects more than one person, even if it's just 1.01, it will keep growing. If it's less than 1, even 0.99, then it will die down. And if we get our immunity up higher, then the R value goes even lower. Another way of looking at this is just kind of thinking about it also, that these squares, 10 squares, represent 100% of the population. Initially, no one has immunity, so 100% of people can get it and they can pass it on to 100% of the population. So we have 100% of spreadability, if you will. But let's say that 30% of people gain immunity. So now that's 3 out of 10 people are immune. They can't get it and therefore they can't give it to someone else. Now 70% of people are available to get it, but also they can only give it to 70% of other people. So now we're down to 49% of the potential contacts from the first example. So already we've reduced the number of contacts, the spreadability, by 51%. So this grows pretty quickly. By the time we have 50% immunity, then we have reduced spreadability by 75%. By the time we're at 60%, now we have reduced it by 84%. And this is where they believe that we have somewhere between this principle and this principle that we are not going to spread that virus, that it's going to decline. Now that doesn't mean that everyone is safe because some people can still get it, and if you're vulnerable, if you're a high-risk group, it could still be devastating for you, but on a societal level that's critical because it's not growing anymore. And if we get up to 80%, now we have reduced the spreadability by 96% because only 20% can get it and they can only give it to another 20%. So we only have 4% of the potential infectious contacts left. As you can see, there's no herd immunity in the beginning, but as this thing catches on, then it kind of increases exponentially in our favor. So immunity, herd immunity, is kind of like an S-curve. We can never get to 100%, but we don't have to. We just need to probably get to 60 or maybe 80%, and then it will slow down to the point where we don't need to worry about it. But as little as 20% has already reduced the contacts, the potentially infectious contacts, by 36%. So already at this level, there's some noticeable effects. There's been a lot of talk about Sweden and herd immunity, and a lot of people are accusing them of risking people's lives in the pursuit of herd immunity. But it's important to understand that that was never an explicit goal. That was not something that Sweden is going for or attempting. It's just something that they're aware of as a potential benefit as this thing progresses. At first they thought they might get herd immunity at a level of 60%, but very recently they have some indications that it might happen at a lower level than that. Here are some interesting numbers. 0.26% of the population in Sweden has been confirmed cases so far. And in Stockholm, which is the biggest city, it's about 20-25% of the population, they have 0.41% of the population being infected. And that's pretty typical. The big cities get hit harder because there's more crowdedness, there's more contact. However, when they did some measurements, they found that even though these numbers are very, very low, as much as 10% of the population in Stockholm was already immune on April 10th. And the way this is going, the trend, they are estimating that sometime in May that they will reach 30% and that sometime in June they will reach 50%. And by that time, they will mostly probably have reached herd immunity and they'll be able to more or less go back to normal. But this number I find very interesting, that already we probably have, because we have somewhere around 30% immunity at the same time that there's 0.4% confirmed cases. That's about a 70 times difference. That means for every person who's a confirmed case, there's up to 70 people who have been infected and have recovered or who didn't even know that they had it. So there's an enormous number of people behind the scenes that are getting infected and are moving this herd immunity forward without becoming part of the statistics. Now let's talk about vaccines a little bit, because a lot of people are waiting for the vaccine as the holy grail, as the thing that's going to turn everything around. But it doesn't quite work like that. Vaccines can reduce the risk, but they cannot eliminate the risk. So here is the vaccine effectiveness according to the CDC for the last 10 or 12 years. And what we see here, the green is the effectiveness of the vaccine for that year. So it kind of depends on how quickly the virus changes and how well they can judge and select the right strains. So some years it's been as low as 20% and other years it's been as high as 60-something. On average, the vaccine has about a 44% effectiveness. That means it reduces the risk of getting the flu, but it doesn't eliminate it. So when I'm talking about these vaccines, it's the flu vaccine. We don't have a corona vaccine. We don't know if and when we're going to get one, but chances are, because they're both viruses and they're similar in some respects, that these parallels would be kind of useful. So if we have a 44% effectiveness, flu effectiveness against infection, that means roughly we get 15 million infections in the US per year instead of 26 million. So we're still going to have a lot of flu around. And it also is estimated that there is a 51 to 65% protection against death, and this has been done in children. And that sounds quite substantial. It sounds like, wow, it's going to save half of all the children who get vaccines. But let's look at what those numbers mean. The flu deaths in children from the year 2010 to 2014 is a 4-year period, 0 to 19 years old. We estimate that they had 6.6 million flu cases, and that's based on the fact that there's 82 million people in that age range and an average of 8% of the population any given year gets the flu. Out of those 6.6 million cases, there were 358 deaths. And 26% of those who died were vaccinated, and 74% of them were not. in that time period, we had 48% of children on average were vaccinated against the flu. So if we take a graphic illustration of this, then the green here would be the children that were vaccinated and died, and the red would be the ones who didn't get vaccinated and died. Now, how do we compare that to the average? How do we make sense of that? If the vaccine had no effect at all, it was no difference at all, then we expect 48% of the kids who got vaccinated to die and 52% who didn't die. So the children who got saved, the beneficial effects of the vaccine, it is considerable, it is definitely statistical, and it takes them from 265 to 190 deaths. So 75 lives were saved by the vaccines. That is during a 4-year period, so that makes it 18 per year that were saved. Now, that is if we did 44 million more vaccines, then we could save those lives. So is that a good idea? Well, some people would say, oh, absolutely, every life is sacred, naturally. But then we also have to ask, is there a downside? Are there any drawbacks other than just the cost of delivering 44 million more vaccines? Are there any adverse reactions? Well, according to the CDC, they're very rare. 1.3 life-threatening reactions per 1 million vaccinations. So if we give 44 million more vaccinations, we'll have 57 life-threatening reactions per year. It doesn't mean that these 57 kids die. It means that if they didn't get emergency care at that point, they probably or possibly would. But those are the severe, immediate, anaphylactic type reactions. What about non-serious reactions? Well, they did some research on that, and now they found that 19% of people who got vaccinated, children who got vaccinated, had some kind of reaction. And this would be something like a fever or a nausea or a swelling at the injection site or aches and pains. So if we give 44 million more vaccinations, we have 8.4 million mild, non-serious reactions. And this was one study that found the 19%. We don't really know because according to this study, which was on NCBI, on National Institute of Health, the government site, these things are usually not reported. People get their vaccine. If nothing happens right then and there, they go home, and if the kid gets a little fussy, they don't really worry about it. But is it possible that out of these 8.4 million, that some percentage might have some residual effect, that they don't resolve 100%, that there is some down the road problem because of that, something unknown? I would say that that is very likely. So this makes it a judgment call, right? If you're a high-risk group, then that might be a good idea, but maybe it's not such a good idea across the board. Another difference we want to be aware of is the way that the body is exposed to the virus, which is the vector of entry. That normally, if you breathe it in or you get it on your skin or you eat it or something, then it's going to encounter the virus, the pathogen is going to encounter an immune barrier. It's going to encounter skin or a mucous membrane or intestinal lining, and in the gut, it's going to come across GALT. And GALT stands for gut-associated lymphoid tissue. You have the majority of your immune cells in the gut. That's where most of them live, because then they can sit there and they can sample and they can fight off the pathogens right as they're coming in, but also they can sample them, they can get a taste for them, they can get an idea of what they're dealing with, and then your immune system goes to work on building up a defense against it. That's a really important part of building a strong immune system, is to expose your GALT, expose your lymphoid tissue to these pathogens. And in a vaccination, you inject it and you bypass all of that. So yes, it's a weakened pathogen that they're injecting, but your body doesn't have the same opportunity to prepare and deal and adapt to it. And in my opinion, this is personal opinion, I think that there is probably a little bit lesser immunity. I don't think it's as complete and solid as if you get exposed to it sort of the natural way. We have to keep in mind that no matter what the situation, the people who are most vulnerable, they're high risk because of something pre-existing. So they might have asthma, COPD, cystic fibrosis, neurological disorders, heart disease, diabetes, obesity. And unfortunately, this is not reserved for the elderly population, even though in the corona situation, it's affecting mostly elderly, but overall and in flu, all of these are strong risk factors for kids as well, and we're seeing more and more of these in very young people, unfortunately. I'm not categorically for or against vaccines. I think the smallpox vaccine, I think it was great that we could use that and eliminate smallpox. But the widespread use of vaccines, I think, is a little overdone sometimes. I think there's a judgment call, and I think there's a time and a place for it. So remember that you can get vaccinated and you can still get the flu. In the case of the coronavirus, you could have immunity, and because it's a contact transmission as well as a droplet, you could shake the hand of someone who's infected and it doesn't affect you and you can't get it, but you can still pass it on to somebody else. Now, let's say hypothetically that a coronavirus vaccine becomes available and it can reduce the risk of death by 50%. Should you take it? Well, I think it's a lot of individual choice and weighing pros and cons here. If you're over 85 years old, then reducing the risk by half could be half of a 15% risk of death. I think that's pretty substantial, so I think there's an argument for it in that case. If you are under 50 and you have no pre-existing condition, you eat real food, and you don't have insulin resistance, then the risk of death might be 0.2% or even a lot less. So cutting that in half may not be as valuable, may not be as big a deal. Personally, I haven't had anything more than a very slight sniffle in many, many years. I can't even think back far enough that I would have had symptoms such as a flu, so I'm not even sure if I've ever had one. I'm guessing that I probably did growing up or a few decades ago, but I'm not sure. So if a corona vaccine becomes available, I would probably think long and hard about it and give it some serious thought. But here's perhaps the primary and strongest argument for a widespread vaccination if it becomes available, and that's the impact of vaccination on the R0 or the reproductive factor. As you recall, it depends on 3 different factors, which is how strong the pathogen is, how many contacts a day we make, and how long it takes. So a vaccine could affect the number of contacts, because if more people are immune, then there's fewer people to give it and there's fewer people to get it. So if a vaccine would have an efficiency of 40 or 50 or 60%, then it could reduce the R0 by that amount, and that could be very substantial. However, this is assuming that by the time we get to a functional and safe vaccine, that we still haven't accomplished any natural herd immunity. If our immunity is 0, then this would make a lot of sense. However, if we have already reached a 60 or 70% herd immunity, then I would say the vaccine would be primarily for the high-risk groups. Let's talk about Sweden and how they've dealt with it. I have a particular interest in Sweden because I'm Swedish. It's my first language. All my family still lives there, including my parents. So I want to know what's happening over there. And I've been digging through their government sites and all the public information and all the Swedish media. And I've gotten a pretty good idea. First of all, Sweden has been called unrestricted. We get this impression that, oh, well, they're just doing whatever they want to over there, which is far from the truth. Sweden had the same goal as everyone else, which is to control the speed of the spread, to not have a growth curve that they couldn't deal with, that would overwhelm the healthcare system. And so far it's been working very well. They have stressed the healthcare system just like most countries, but they have not been anywhere near of maximizing or overloading it. And that's been the primary concern, like I said. They just felt like they could meet that goal without having a mandatory lockdown. What they have done is they encourage social distancing, just like everybody else. They encourage telecommuting. And the main difference from other countries is they've kept the schools open. And we'll come back to that on why that's not such a bad idea. They have limited crowds to 50. They've kept the restaurants open, but restaurants who fail to meet the recommendations or the guidelines, who crowd people too much, they get closed down. Sweden has made it very easy for people to stay home if they feel even a hint of a sniffle or a sore throat. Normally, if people get sick for a week, then they don't get paid for the first day that they're gone, but then they get paid for the rest of the week. But as soon as the corona hit, then they did away with what they call the karensdag, which is a qualifying day. So now people can stay home and not lose any pay. They don't have that qualifying day at all. I think maybe, in my opinion, that Sweden was a little more realistic at the outset on how long this thing was going to be around. I think a lot of people thought, a lot of countries thought, if they just shut down for a couple of weeks, then they'd be fine. But Sweden was looking for a sustainable solution. They knew that this was going to be around for 6 months. So if you can't do it for 6 months, then you're going to have to break those principles at some point. So a lot of harsh opinions have been voiced about how Sweden is paying a big price. They're paying a hard price. They're gambling with people's lives. But we'll look at some numbers, and my impression is that I think everyone is going to pay a high price, but maybe it's just a question of when we're paying it, now or later. Here's a graph of the new cases in Sweden from March 22nd through May 11th, so just under 2 months. And the blue bars are the new cases per day, and the red line is a rolling 7-day average to kind of smooth out and give you an idea of the trend. And as you can see, it grew in the beginning of March like most countries, and then it sort of leveled off, and then it looks like it has a tendency to go down a little bit. When we look at the death cases in Sweden, then it's the same basic shape of the graph, but maybe we're seeing even more so a little bit stronger downtrend. So it doesn't look like they're paying a tremendous price or that it's completely out of control. If we compare Sweden to the United States, then of course the scale is going to be very different because of the population difference, but the shape of the red line is roughly the same. We have an upturn, and then we've got a plateau, and maybe toward the end we have a slight downtrend. Same thing with both with cases, new cases and new deaths. And if we compare Sweden to the rest of the world, then we see the same thing. The only exception maybe being that the world has so many countries at different stages, and some countries are behind, so we're not seeing a downtrend at all, but more so just a steady plateau. So does Sweden have a lot of cases? Not really. When we look at cases per million people, per capita, by country, we see that Sweden is certainly not the lowest. There are many countries in the world who are way lower than anyone on this graph, But in the European community, then Sweden's doing fairly well. They're a lot higher than some of their Scandinavian neighbors that they've been compared to, and that's the reason they have got a lot of criticism. But who do you compare to? Why would you compare to Norway rather than Netherlands or Belgium? They're all similar sized countries, and Belgium has about twice the number of cases. If we look at deaths by capita per million people, same thing. We compare Norway and Sweden. Sweden looks really bad because Norway has done really well, but Sweden is right there with the Netherlands, and it's less than half the deaths per population compared to Belgium. So of course none of this is done, none of this is over, but it certainly looks like Sweden is not paying a higher price or a significantly higher price than any comparable country. One thing they did learn the hard way, unfortunately, is how hard this hit the elderly population. So it's not so much about containing the spread in the general population as it is protecting the elderly. And Sweden wasn't fast enough, so this got a foothold in some retirement homes and some elderly people's communities. And before they had a chance to shut it down, the damage was already done. As a result, we see that 88% of deaths are in people over 70, 95% of deaths are people over 60, and 98% are people over 50. Now, a lot of the criticism has been on schools. They say it's irresponsible to send your kids to school, but there have been no death cases in people under 20, not a single one. And then people say, well, they go to school and then they spread the virus around. Well, primarily, as long as you keep them away from the elderly, as long as you have containment and no visitation on the elderly, then these kids are primarily going to see their parents, who are going to be mostly in the 30 to 40 to 49 year range, and they are also not affected hardly at all. People under 50 are less than 2% of the death cases. So the whole point of this is they've gotten critique for letting people go to parks and go to school and go to restaurants. But what we're seeing is the people who go to school and who are out, they are the people who are not affected. So as long as they stay away from the elderly, they're not really affecting the outcome. They're not killing people. If anything, maybe they're helping produce some immunity. So I'm not going to say who is right. I'm not going to say that one way is better than the other, but maybe they're just different ways of handling it. However, one question that's really important is, if it's not going away, if it's going to be with us, then we put in some restrictive measures. The question is, are we going to be able to keep it up for months or years? Are we going to be able to keep doing what we're doing for 6 months, for 12 months, for 18 months? Probably not. The US is already seeing the highest unemployment and the highest financial strain since the Great Depression 100 years ago. So the answer to this question, can you keep it up for months and years? In Sweden, the answer is probably yes. They found a way, and I'm not saying that's for everybody, but they were able to do that for their societal structure and their level of personal responsibility and so forth. It seems to be working. Could other countries say yes to that question? I think that's very questionable. I don't think most countries can keep it up. The vast majority of information in the news media has been on reporting the number of cases and how to wash your hands and how to protect yourself. And that's because, first of all, the media, their job is to scare people, that's to get attention. But more so, it's because the government is sending out the information. The government is producing this, is the source of this information. And the government's goal is not necessarily the same as yours. They go hand in hand, but the government needs to keep the spread down. It needs to avoid overloading the healthcare system, the crisis system, right? and you're part of that. But as an individual, your priorities are different. So you basically have two choices. You can wait for a vaccine and hope that it's going to do the trick, or you can change the odds. And what do we mean by that? Let's talk about the odds. If and when a vaccine becomes available, hypothetically, it might be reducing the risk of death by 50%. Might be better, might be worse. We don't know. We also don't know when and if it'll come, and we know that they're rushing it. They're very anxious to get it done in time, so we don't know how solid and how reliable and safe it's going to be at that point. But it might be able to reduce the risk somewhere in the 50% range. We also know that the risk factors for the coronavirus, age is the primary risk factor, but the older people are mostly at risk because they have more diabetes and more degeneration and more heart disease and more of these pre-existing conditions. We know that these risk factors can increase the risk from very, very low, probably 0.3 or even less, all the way up to 10 or maybe 15%. So that's more than a 30-fold increase, that there are risk factors. The vaccine can reduce it by 50%. The risk factors can increase it by 3,000%. What if we could change that? What if we could change the odds? What if we could reverse some or even most of these 3,000%? That would have a far greater impact than a vaccine ever could. And this is something that you have in your hands. I've done a lot of videos on the immunity and the coronavirus, but I want to mention one thing about viruses need sugar, right? They don't metabolize sugar directly, but the virus can't replicate unless it gets into your cell and uses the energy resources of your cell. And the virus is clever enough to manipulate your intracellular messengers. So those messengers bring in more glucose to turn into energy that the virus then uses for replication. So the virus tricks you into bringing in more glucose. So the higher your glucose, your blood sugar levels, the more fuel, the more energy is available for virus replication. And if that doesn't make you think twice about sugar, I don't know what will. Sugar further, of course, triggers insulin and insulin resistance, which is involved in all the other risk factors to bring up that 3,000%. So here's something I've been wondering about. I went to Costco the other day to buy some food, and now they're not letting people in without wearing a face mask. They're obviously very concerned with protecting people. So they're wiping down the cart, and you have to wear a face mask, and they tell people to stay 6 feet apart, and there's dots on the floor and lines and everything. So they're very keen on protecting you. But something that I noticed is that people filled their carts with the same amount of sugar as ever before, maybe more. Because of all the confinement and the quarantine, they're stressed and they need comfort food, they think. So they're buying the soda and the ice cream and the cookies and the donuts and the snacks and the crackers. All of these things that either are sugar or turn into sugar. So maybe you can help me figure this out. If they're so concerned with protecting people, how come they're still selling so much of the stuff that destroy people's health? If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to learn more about health and how the body really works, I think that you really liked that video as well. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.